Welcome back to What is This Weapon? And welcome back if you've been paying attention to this very short series, two-parter, on essentially select rifles from East and West is kind of what we've covered previously. We covered the G3, the German G3 rifle previously, and what that kind of means in a Cold War sense. And with me again is Ian from Cold War Conversations to tell me relevant things about the Cold War. And tell us first of all, what Cold War Conversations is, in case people haven't seen part one, but please go back and watch it.
Yeah, please do. And thank you for having me on. So Cold War Conversations is primarily an oral history podcast. So if you've ever wondered what it would be like to escape across the Berlin Wall, or be a guard on the Iron Curtain, or even a KGB spy in the US, then it's the podcast for you. It's available on all major podcast platforms. And as I always say, there's nothing like hearing history from those who were there.
So as I think I said last time, trying to avoid that kind of schoolboy trope of this versus that, Spitfire versus Messerschmitt, G3 versus AK. But that is kind of what we're doing with this two-part series here. So we've covered the, dare I say, Gucci, Western, capitalist, commercial G3 last time, and what that tells us about the economies, the governments, and a bit about the conflict as well. The much more immediate and obvious Cold War rifle for most, I dare say, is the Kalashnikov, the AK. AK-47, we have a video about what that actually means separately. Go and check that out. What I have in front of us just to kick off, Ian, is generically an AK-47. I prefer AK. It's what we dub in the sort of specialist collector museum community a Type 1. It's the first type of AK that was produced. This one is from 1951, as you can see there. So I think someone's highlighted that in white. It shouldn't necessarily be, but so we can show. Just to prove, this is very early. Not our earliest. We showed that in the other video. That's from 1950 and is one of the few AKs you can actually call an AK-47. But what can I say about this that hasn't been said before? Clearly it is Russian, specifically Russian in origin, but Soviet Union in the wider sense. Nothing proliferates like this thing. Our sort of frame of reference has been East and West Germany and East and West Berlin, and the idea that on one side of the wall you've got G3s, and on the other side you've got East German AKs, which we'll come to in a moment. But the origin, of course, is the Soviet, the Russian original. It's the template for everything that follows. It's not invented in a vacuum. It does come in one way or another from the German Sturmgewehr assault rifle, which is where we get that term from originally. In concept, it is a reduced power cartridge, lower recoil, lower ammunition weight, all those advantages, with a relatively short barrel, only 16 inches on this compared to the much longer G3 barrel that we had last time. It's conceived of as a glorified submachine gun, and introduced as such alongside the SKS carbine. But that kind of goes by the board. This becomes the standard Soviet Union and then Soviet bloc Warsaw Pact. That whole sphere of influence, they all end up with AKs, as we touched on last time. So you must come across this thing all the time in your work.
Without doubt, without doubt. It always crops up. I mean, I think the earliest instance that I see of the AK is in the Hungarian uprising of 1956, which was when in Budapest there was a student protest which grew into a nationwide uprising. A former communist leader of Hungary, reformist prime minister named Imre Nagy, was returned to power. He declared Hungary to be neutral, and the Soviet Union or Soviet troops withdrew for a while and then came back, surprisingly, and were fighting directly with Hungarian army forces and civilian insurgents. And there's a number of photos of insurgents actually carrying the AK-47, most likely captured from Soviet troops.
Yeah, this is where the West first sees AKs. They've been produced since 1949. I think by then we already have this the idea that they're going to become the new standard service rifle, and they proliferate from there. But it's really the first time that there's I think, is it CIA sketch that's somebody saw one at a guard post and made a furtive back of a cigarette packet. It's terrible.
Yeah.
And that's our first sighting, other than the guys who saw it with their own eyes, of course. So this is ground zero, really, for the AK. And if you go back to that earlier episode where we talk about the word AK-47 or the term, that the star AK of that is in fact a Hungarian AK-55, because nearly all, I think, of the AKs that you'll be coming across in that conflict incident are going to be Soviet made, whereas from 1955 onwards they are making their own locally under a form of license from the Soviets.
Right.
This is not. This is an original, as I say. So that licensing, that proliferation of nation states in the orbit of the Soviet Union making their own versions leads us back around to that East and West Germany, East and West Berlin, Cold War, not confrontation of G3s on one side and AKs on the other. Let me just grab the East German MPiK. So here we are. Nerdily, this is a Type 3 AK or AK-47 if you prefer, where we've got this machined lower receiver. There's the MPiK MS later on, which is their version of the East German version of the AKM, sheet metal receiver. For the soldier, the experience is the same. It doesn't really change. I doubt many of them, well, they would have noticed a difference in weight. But this is the first East German copy of the famous AK. We've even got the bayonet attached to this one. Very important for, well, mainly guarding prisoners actually, but does get used for other things. But we're focusing on the rifle. In case anyone's wondering, like how the heck would you tell? Well, in the sort of media that you're looking at as a historian, you're probably not going to be able to tell, other than through context. You know they're East German, so they're going to have East German MPiKs. Maschinenpistole Kalashnikov. To absolutely butcher the language. The only way you would know is if you had a close-up, which we will give you. Instead of the Cyrillic markings for automatic and semi-automatic, there isn't one for safe on this, we have the German D and E for Dauerfeuer and Einzelfeuer. Double shot and single shot, essentially. I hope I've got that right, German people. And as with all AKs, that means your single shot is the bottom setting. But this is exactly what the earlier border guards would have been carrying. And these have such a life to them that I'm sure there's a huge overlap between this and the later version. So what can you tell us about the actual sort of carriage and use of this?
Well, I mean, the East German border guards were obviously trained to guard the border, and there's a lot of talk about the shoot-to-kill order that they were under. Now, in fact, the orders that they had was to call a warning to any escapee, fire a warning shot if that wasn't followed, and if they still didn't stop, was to try and shoot them in the legs. Now, obviously, that didn't happen in every case, and it's estimated that about 1,000 people were killed trying to escape across the East German border into West Germany, and also trying to escape across into West Berlin. Now, I think about 70 of those were border guards who were shot in some of those attempts. I think there was a bit of blue on blue activity going on there. But one of the interviews that I've done on Cold War Conversations was with an East German guy who was a conscript into the MVA, the East German Army. And he talked about being at school when a teacher returned from his military service. And the teacher mentioned that he'd served in the border guards. And bravely, one of his classmates said, "Did you shoot anybody?" And the teacher said, "I didn't, and I didn't need to shoot anybody, because all I had to do was to cock the weapon. And that sound at night would carry, and they would stop in their tracks." And it's things like that that I really love about doing Cold War conversations, is those sort of details and those personal accounts that perhaps you wouldn't find in a book. But it sort of really brings it home when you know, holding one of these and seeing one of these and realizing what went on. I mean, this is East German. This could well have been used to stop an escape at some point.
Yeah, that's one of the only, maybe the only downside of our collection is that the number of things that have that detailed history are so few. It could have just been in an armory for all of its life, or it could have been involved in some heavy fighting. But it's incredible to kind of think about, and it stands for those things, even if it wasn't there. And you've been able to actually replicate that. You can in this space, you can get a sense of how, in the still of night, that would stop you in your tracks.
Yeah, I found that quite powerful, doing that in a disturbing sort of way. I'm not used to handling weapons, and that brought it home. Yeah,
no, I understand that. And we've been looking recently at decorated weapons and how they're a sort of more of a potential weapon, a kind of implied violence rather than ever actually being used for violence. This is kind of both, with the bayonet fitted and the intimidation of racking the action, as it were, before ever firing a shot. And then, as you said, you've got stages of escalation there before you actually kill someone. That's all. It's grim stuff, but it's fascinating. So, can you, beyond moving beyond Germany into the wider Cold War, you must have come across some fascinating AK stories or AK related stories.
Yeah, I think one of the ones that I find quite iconic and is a lesser known part of Cold War history was the iconic photo of Chilean President Salvador Allende in the 1970s. He was a socialist prime minister who narrowly won a presidential election in Chile. The US and the CIA, needless to say, tried to destabilize his government, so there was a military coup financed by the CIA. He was holed up in the presidential palace, and there's a photo of him holding an AK-47, and he's wearing just an ordinary pullover and glasses. He looks like a professor or somebody like that. Now, shortly after that photo was taken, the presidential palace was stormed. There's a radio announcement that Allende made, and you can hear the gunfire and the battle going on in the background. He'd been presented with an AK-47 by Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba. And there's two stories as to how Allende met his death. One was that he fought with his AK-47 and was shot dead by the Chilean military. And the most likely one is he committed suicide with that AK-47.
Wow, that is quite the story. We get a bit fixated on the sort of direct conflict combat, how the rifles are designed to be used. But when you get a story like that, that's so down to one individual and geopolitical significance, it's really fascinating stuff. So, Ian, we've talked a lot about the sort of dichotomy, the two sides and how they have their own weapons, and they don't really cross over, but they do cross over, don't they? One side will get hold of the other side's weapons at various points in history. Have you seen that yourself?
Yeah, I think a good example is Detachment A, which some viewers may be familiar with. They were a US Army Special Forces unit who were based in Berlin during the Cold War. Their role was, in the event of invasion, to stay behind and create sabotage or guerrilla units, but also to venture into East Germany and blow up bridges and any other strategic objectives. There were a couple of good reasons for Detachment A to use the AK-47. One was if they used it, then the East German troops or Soviet troops nearby would think that they were friendlies. And the second one is they might be picking up captured weapons whilst they're marauding around East Germany as well, and need to be familiar with the usage of the weapon.
Yeah, on that first of those two points, to reference a movie, it does make a distinctive sound when fired. So legitimately, at least for a period of time, if something kicked off and you hear that pop, 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 pop of AK-47 fire or AK fire, you are going to think it will buy the unit some time at the very least. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, There's another example I've been reading about recently with MACV-SOG, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, originally Special Operations Group, and then they euphemized the name to Studies and Observations Group. I love that kind of military euphemism. And they used AKs, but it was only for a period of time because they needed to be deniable. They were operating behind enemy lines in foreign countries, including in North Vietnam. And so they even dressed as NVA or VC. And given that most of their teams comprised indigenous troops, that was a bit more convincing than when it was the 6'2" white guys doing it. But they all did it, and they would carry local weapons. As soon as there were enough captured US weapons in foreign countries in that area to make that not worth doing, they then switched to their favoured Western weapon, which was an AR-15 derivative. Right. But so that there are these instances of Western troops using Eastern weapons and vice versa. There's a bit of a trope here, though, of the AK is so much more reliable and superior to, let's say, M16. That the usually American troops want to pick that up and use it by preference. You will find the occasional mention of that. I think it's overblown for a number of reasons. Logistics, you don't know what condition that enemy weapon is in. They were booby-trapping weapons and ammo in Vietnam as well. So, and you tend to go with what you're trained with, what you're familiar with, what you trust. So yeah, there's a period of time where the M16 isn't the most reliable thing in the world, and you've got guys picking up these things. But it's a bit overblown, and actually more interesting are instances like you've just given us there.
Yeah. And I think you're right there, because I mean, that unique sound profile, if you said it instantly picks you out if you're fighting against Viet Cong, as makes you potentially a target for US troops.
That as well, and if they get unfortunately killed or captured, there's a little bit of deniability there as to who they are. They would remove all their patches and any identifying stuff, and they'd be denied. They were operating essentially the same as spies. They were treated and would be treated as spies. But then they stopped caring about the weapons after a certain point.
I seem to remember there's a flag that has the AK-47 on it.
That's right. Yeah, if I learned recently, there are 3 flags in I think world history that have weapons on them, and only one that has a modern firearm. And that modern firearm is, of course, the AK, and it's Mozambique, which allows us to circle back once again to this whole AK-G3 thing, because in the Mozambique civil conflict, it's not as straightforward as just one side only used the AK and one side only used the G3. But in that sort of mess of different weapons that we used, absolutely there are both of those on each side, government and rebel forces, and that is embodied in a couple of objects in our collection. We have a video about this as well, if you'd like to search that up. But in brief, a local artist in Mozambique created a couple of sculptures using, it's almost like swords into plowshares kind of thing. And you can readily see the buttstock of a G3, the trunnion of an AK, if you know what you're looking at. And from the sort of source material you'll be looking at, you find yourself picking out what the different weapons are. And they are blended together because the two sides came together in conflict and then had to try and find a way through peace afterwards.
Absolutely.
So we've got the stereotypical weapons of two sides. We've got when one side uses the other side's weapons. What about AK coming up against AK? There are so many of those. That must be happening as we speak, I would have thought. You presumably come across that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the ones that's probably lesser known is the Chinese-Soviet conflict of 1969, where both countries went to war over some disputed islands on a river in northern China. At the time, China was not getting on with the Soviet Union. They felt that they'd become revisionist and were dropping their Marxism Leninist doctrine. So there was friction there. And at one point, the Soviets apparently were considering using their nuclear weapons to take out China's nascent nuclear technology that was just coming on stream.
Wow.
So it was a really dangerous situation. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed and they agreed where the border was. But I think over 100 or 200 troops were killed in that conflict, and it included tanks and aircraft and, you know, a significant amount of heavy weapons as well.
So many of these incidents that you just, unless you immerse yourself in this subject matter, you don't come across. I mean, this is the business you're in, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that schism between the Chinese and the Soviets is reflected in the hardware as well. You know, we see these. They start out with this shared design, and they split off, and you can see the design lineage of the Chinese AK deviating away, not massively. You know, they're functionally interchangeable in the conflict zones around the world today, but the markings, little details of construction that we look out for, and they help you identify. You know, just like a G3 tells you something about the conflict photo you're looking at, we can go into the nerdy detail of, well, that's a slightly different AK, which means it's come from this proliferation path, as it were. Now, unfortunately, Chinese AKs are just so prolific that it probably doesn't tell you very much, but nonetheless, they are. The material culture always reflects the history, the politics, and all of that, which is why we've got you here today.
Yeah, well, as my wife says, I'm full of useless information.
Funnily enough, mine says something very similar.
There you go. I mentioned before the tale of the East German border guard there. One of the interviews I did was with a guy who tried to escape across the Czechoslovak border to West Germany, and he gave me a fascinating account of actually being under fire from an AK-47. He described it as never hearing anything so loud, and it was a really powerful description because he described the leaves and the branches falling from the trees above him, because these Czechoslovak border guards had obviously aimed high as a warning shot, but he says immediately his friends stopped and stood where they were.
I don't blame them at all. Maybe we can put some links in the description to some of these episodes that you've referenced.
Yeah, absolutely.
They sound fascinating. Well, I do have one more sort of AK to show you that I think will tie together the two episodes and finish things off.
I'm intrigued.
Now, that's that DDR AK that we looked at earlier. There is a whole series of these things. They develop through time, and different variants. There's a paratrooper version, for example, which is where the stock on this thing comes from. But this isn't actually an East German military AK. This is developed as a commercial venture, which I think is fascinating. So this is the Wieger, this is the StG 942, and it's developed, it looks quite different.
Very.
It's developed in 5.56 millimeter, famously a NATO cartridge, the cartridge that replaced many NATO nations' 7.62 rifle cartridge that we were talking about in the G3 episode. So time has moved on. This is developed from 1981 to sort of mid-80s, goes into production in 1988, and it's we're getting quite portentous here with some of these dates. And it stops production in 1990. Why might that be, Ian?
Well, I can't think why. It's interesting they start production of it in 88 for export, because at that point the East German economy was a basket case, but is becoming a complete train wreck. They're desperate for hard currency at this point, and the thought that they're going to try and export these to the capitalist imperialists of the West just shows how desperate they've got in terms of trying to keep their country afloat and their economy afloat. I'm fascinated by this weapon.
Yeah, I mean, there are various modernized takes on the Kalashnikov platform. The Israeli Galil being one, and it's kind of West in front, East in the back, if I may. But with a Western cartridge as well. So I guess aft of the chamber, which is where the 5.56 cartridge goes, this is AK. This is East German AK. The pistol grip is new and now black plastic. This is a brand new design of very Western looking polymer handguard. They've incorporated the front sight that normally lives up here into the gas block, which makes it look rather different as well. More like an M16, we might say, or an AR-18. And it has the flash suppressor of the M16.
Yeah.
So it's like it's kind of an AK in a party dress.
Yeah. Yeah. I particularly love the fully automatic setting marked by an infinity symbol. So this is the Call of Duty version.
Funnily enough, this might be one of the only AKs that hasn't been represented in a Call of Duty game. But yeah, not the only nation to go with the infinity symbol for automatic. But yeah, we've moved away from the German letters for German words to an export-friendly Arabic 1 and international infinity symbol, meaning all the bullets, one of the bullets, none of the bullets. So yeah, this is pretty rare because of the reunification of Germany. It kind of went nowhere. They were planning to make 200,000 of these a year. Would you believe, for this mythical nearly mythical Western market? Now, by that point, there was a lot of fascination among gun collectors and shooters with the arms of the Eastern Bloc. They were desperately wanting authentic Russian or Chinese or whatever AKs, and they were trickling through with various restrictions and sanctions that caused problems there. And US trade laws, actually, you had to make a certain amount of the gun in the country. So people are trying to import things for semi-automatic versions for collectors and shooters. This would, in theory, have been a slam dunk for that market. It's a curiosity. You take it to the range, show it off to your friends. It's an AK, but it's not. It's Western, but it's Eastern. So it could have been a big hit, but the huge economic upheaval of the two countries reunifying, and the parallel to this, I guess, is the G11. The absolute crazy, futuristic, let's try all the new technologies at once weapon that the West Germany was working on. So this commercial venture from East Germany fails because of that economic car crash, as it were, and that what should have been the new service rifle of the Bundeswehr also goes nowhere in parallel to it. So the two kind of collide and fall apart. And you're stuck with more G3s for a bit longer and AKs for not much longer because we have to standardise the new Bundeswehr on the G3.
And I guess it's the peace dividend as well. The threat has gone away, and therefore, we don't need to necessarily be developing any better weapons at this point in time. I mean, I really like this. Looks great. I mean, not iconic enough for a flag, but it's a. If you can say it about a weapon, it's a nice looking weapon, this.
And it is, I know I've said it already, but it's East meets West in a gun.
Mm-hmm. So in 1989, the East really does meet the West. The Berlin Wall opens almost by accident. The East Germany stumbles on for another year, but in the meantime, the population have voted for reunification with West Germany. And once reunification occurs, the West German government, or the German government now, starts to close down uneconomic enterprises. And the manufacture of the AK was one of those victims.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if the Visa company, the Wieger, by the way, is the Visa, the factory, the company, and GER for Germany. Maybe if they'd landed those initial contracts that I gather they were working on, that might have been viable. But I suspect there would have been enough going on behind the scenes economically that probably no company was going to be viable. They'd have to be reconstituted in some way.
And West German companies wouldn't want another competitor on the block. So,
and I have to wonder if, even would this even be acceptable as a product for Germany to export now that it's fully looking west? It's not. At the end of the day, it's just an AK. Let's focus on that cool Western Gucci kit that we now identify the West with.
And was there an HK equivalent of this at that time?
That's the other thing. Is there really any point? Certainly, in any government-supported way, in pushing an AK variant when you have the proliferating and excellent H&K series of weapons in all shapes and sizes. So yeah, absolutely. There are, by this point, there are H&K rifles in 5.56. There's still the G3. They're very modular as well, so it's easy to have a sort of mix and match approach to manufacture and adapting to what the customer wants. So H&K is where, you know, all of the eggs are in that basket pretty much at that point. Other companies are sort of resurgent under old names, and new companies come around, but H&K remains the dominant force in Germany for small arms, and still is, and international. You know, they are a multinational company selling to absolutely everybody. That G3 series of rifles, that family, that quirky operating system that we spoke about last time, that's fading away. But they are not. They are still very much around, as is Kalashnikov, as a company literally called Kalashnikov Concern. So the two halves of this story rumble on into the present and the future as well. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in these two episodes with these two iconic Cold War weapons. And thank you so much for joining us. I think this has really added a lot to you know, it's great talking about guns, but to marry them up with the history as well is fantastic. Do you have any sort of takeaways from what we've covered, just to end up on? Yeah,
I mean, I think, you know, the Cold War was an ideological battle, and a battle of thoughts, a battle of ideas. But what we've gone through with these two episodes is to show that ideological battle wasn't just in the politics and the economies, it was also in the rival small arms weapons as well. And it's been fascinating seeing some of the different variants that I wasn't aware of, and to learn about those and share some of the stories that you get on the Cold War Conversations podcast.
Yeah, I think the thing we have to remember, you know, I get very focused on the weapons technology, but at the end of the day, this is a piece of technology like any other. You know, you could do something similar on, I don't know, the Trabant car or a tractor or a toaster even, and how it reflects the engineering, the design, the manufacture, the sale, the marketing, the export, all of that. And we've touched on, I think, all of those. But of course, here we do weapons and armour, so we focus on the weapons. And there's always there's an extra interest and excitement wherever weapons come up. So if you feel the same about weapons technology, please do join us again here on What's This Weapon next week. You'll also want to check out, I hope, our website, where you can find details on everything from our 3 museums, the events that go on there, our social media channels. TikTok has been going pretty hard lately, I gather. And of course, over at Cold War Conversations as well, you're definitely going to want to check out some of those episodes. So where can they find those episodes, Ian? Well, we're all over social media, but coldwarconversations.com is the best destination. And I'd like to thank you for inviting me in. It's been a joy. Any other Cold War hardware you want me to talk about, call me back. Thanks so much, Ian.